Hello everybody, welcome to the part 2 video of my Holset HE351 installation video for a first gen Dodge Cummins. What we're looking at right now is the HX35 that I currently have on my motor. Obviously the first step is to take off the old turbo, but before I do that I wanted to verify a couple things to make sure that this will be a quick, smooth, easy installation, because I want to try to do all of this in one day so I can have my truck for tomorrow. Not the end of the world if I don't, but I've got all this stuff that I think I need. I verified that I have the correct diameter intake tube that fits on the new turbo, verified that the oil inlet and outlet is the same. I have the proper V-band that I will weld onto this downpipe. I'll have to take the downpipe off, cut off the 3-inch V-band and weld on a special, it's like a weird 3 3/4-inch-ish V-band flange that I got from thehungrydiesel.com. And gaskets and such, intercooler tubing. Make sure I have all of that. And now I'm ready to take the turbo off. Well, I got the HX35 off and I am done for the day, because all of the how-to threads on forums and all the questions and comments and videos and everything all over the internet about doing HE351 swaps on a first-gen Cummins, nobody at all thought to mention that the flange on the 351 is way thicker than the flange on the HX35. So when you put this on, the studs don't go through far enough and you can't put a nut on. So you got to take this housing off and have it machined. While I'm waiting for the flange to get machined on the turbo, I'm going to work on the downpipe. I cut off the original 3-inch flange that was on here. Now this, I should mention, this is an aftermarket downpipe. It's a 4-inch pipe with a 3-inch V-band on it that was meant to go on the original turbo, but it also fit the HX35. But the HE351 has a larger V-band, so I cut this off. It was right on there like that. I just cut it off, and then I used a torch to open up the hole a little bit so it matches the inside diameter of my V-band flange that I bought from the Hungry Diesel. And the last thing I'm going to do, just for clearance reasons, I'm going to grind this a little bit thinner. And the reason I'm going to make this a little bit thinner is just so this flange isn't sticking out so far. I want the flange to be in about like that, because that's roughly how far out this original V-band lip was. And I don't think there would be any clearance issues if I used it as is, but I just want to keep it as original as possible so I don't have to cut this off and re-weld it and grind it again, just to save myself some trouble. So I chucked this up in a lathe, and I faced it down thinner. I took about 1/4 of an inch off, and you can see I also put a nice bevel there for welding it, so I didn't have to grind a bevel on there. It was a hell of a lot easier on the lathe. So I'll weld the flange on just like that. I have this great little 120 volt flux core MIG welder that I have on loan from a friend of mine. I always shit on little 110 welders, especially MIG welders, but this thing runs really well. It's a Lincoln, not some off-brand. So it does a really good job, and I'm going to use it to weld this. It does an excellent job on exhaust tubing. Welded the flange on to the downpipe. Gotta say, it came out pretty damn well with this little 110 MIG welder. Weld the outside and put some weld on the inside too, just for good measure. Figured since I could reach it, I might as well hit it. Okay, now I've got the exhaust housing on the turbo machined down, so it fits, and I just have this loosely bolted on, just finger tight, and I'm checking all my clearances and everything and my alignments. One thing I noticed is that this stud here interferes, which is another thing that nobody online or on any of the forums or how-to threads mentioned, so I'm going to have to shave that down just a little bit. I have already adjusted the alignment of the center housing. You notice that the oil feed is pretty much vertical, but the important thing to line up is not just this more or less vertically, but the lower drain tube, you can see it right there, that's the oil drain tube for the turbo. There isn't much flex in that. So loosen up this V-band, get this housing so it rotates easily, and push the flange of that oil drain tube up against the flange on the bottom of the center housing and make sure that mates up nice and flat. And that should be a good orientation, and then tighten the V-band back down. And of course the oil feed line will fit just fine. Now for the compressed air outlet, here's my old setup. The HX35 dumped out way lower than the HE351. So I think what I'm going to do now is, with the turbo just on here loosely, I am going to fabricate the new compressed air outlet tube. I have this piece of tubing that I bought on eBay, 3-inch mandrel bent. It's a pretty nifty, helpful piece of pipe. It's got a 45 and then a U-bend, which can either be 290s or 180. Aluminized steel. And I will use that to fabricate this. I think I'm only going to need the 45 degree to go this way and then that way, but I like having all of these bends available to me so I can use whatever I need, and whatever I don't use I will just have for later for some other project. So it was just as easy as that. All I used was a section of the 45 degree bend, as you can see. I started off by cutting it long, and then I held it up and eyeballed it, cut it a little bit shorter, because you can cut it shorter but you can't cut it longer. So just to help you guys out there, starting from roughly the middle of the 45 degree bend, the short end of my tube is about 4 inches long, and the long end is about 10 or so. The other thing I might do, even though it's kind of expensive, is to buy a new one of these, because this boot is an original boot off of a, I believe, 1994 Dodge Cummins, and it's just, it is weak, it is squishy, it is spent. These cheap boots I buy on eBay from some China place are stiffer and thicker, and they seem to be better quality than the OEM one, so I might buy a new aftermarket one of these just for security. Now the next thing I'm going to do, I'm going to take this out, clean it up, and paint it red just like my turbo and my valve covers and everything else, just to make it match. So I took the turbo off of the truck again, and now I'm going to fabricate my spring gate. I've mentioned it before, and now I'm going to explain to you what exactly it is. This is the wastegate of the turbo. And as I'm sure you guys know, it remains closed until boost pressure reaches a certain point, and then the wastegate actuator opens up this flapper valve, and then that exhaust going into the turbo, and it bypasses it right down the exhaust rather than going through the turbine. On this turbo originally, and on say the HX35 and I'm sure a lot of other turbos, that wastegate is open and closed by a wastegate actuator, which is a little diaphragm with a rod coming out, and the rod is attached to the lever there, and when boost pressure pushes on the diaphragm and overcomes the spring on the other side of the diaphragm, it pushes the rod. But on this particular turbo, there's a number of reasons why I'm not going with that type of wastegate. The biggest reason is because I clocked all of these housings from the stock location so they can fit my truck. So the wastegate mounted here is obviously not going to reach over here. Also, I don't want to use the factory wastegate solenoid, which on the HE351, depending on whether the solenoid is energized or de-energized, it allows the wastegate to open at either 20 or 40 psi. And I don't want either 20 or 40 psi. I think 40 is a little too much and 20 isn't enough. I want about 30 or 35 psi. I think that's where I'm going to be happiest. Also, I don't want to rely on a solenoid valve to open or close and control my boost pressure. I just want really purely mechanical means to make this thing work. And the way it works, this wastegate flapper valve will be held closed with a spring, and then when the drive pressure on the inlet side of the exhaust housing gets to a certain point, it will force open the flapper valve, just due to the pressure acting on this flapper valve. And of course, the amount of drive pressure is related to the amount of boost pressure. So I'm going to make a bracket. It's going to bolt onto here, curve around over this way, and then I will have a hole in the bracket with an eye bolt, a threaded eye bolt that will attach to the spring. And I can thread the nuts in and out on the eye bolt to either increase or decrease tension on that spring, and thus increase and decrease the point at which my wastegate opens and closes. So here's a cardboard template that I made. As you can see, it'll mount right about there, curve around, and right where that, or roughly where that crosshairs is where the hole for the eye bolt will go. Now the next step is to cut the spring gate holder out of a piece of plate. This is, I don't know, 1/4 inch plate or so. It ought to be just fine. Now here's a suggestion for you. I'm cutting this with a torch, and if you guys have ever cut anything with a torch before, you've probably noticed that it's hard to follow a line, whether you use a chalk line or soapstone or especially a Sharpie marker or something. So here's a little trick that I figured out. Put your stencil down, draw the line with the Sharpie or whatever you have lying around. Now it's a little tedious, but take a center punch and punch along the line, and those center punch marks will not go away with the heat. You can just keep following them with the torch, and the Sharpie marker or the soapstone marker, whatever you use, that'll just disappear with the torch. You won't be able to follow it, but you can always follow those dots. So I mocked everything up, and it seems to fit and work pretty well. I had to put the bolts through this direction because the nuts and washers wouldn't fit if they came through on this side. There will be a nut on either side of this eye bolt, so once I get the spring tension to the correct tension, I can run the two nuts together and jam them together and lock in my adjustment. I had to heat up and bend the end of my spring just a little bit to give a little bit more clearance between the lever here and the spring coils. I just did that with a propane torch and a pair of pliers. It's very easy, but make sure to let it cool down naturally. Don't dunk it in water to cool it down faster. Just let it cool on its own, because with higher carbon steels and spring steels like this, you can make it brittle by quenching it too quickly when it's hot, and you especially don't want this to get brittle, because if this breaks while you're driving, your wastegate is just going to open right up. If that did happen, you could fix it on the side of the road by tying this closed with a piece of baling wire, but then you would have no wastegate at all, but it would get you home. So I painted my spring gate bracket, and I was in a rush and the paint was still sticky, so I just threw it on there anyway. It'll dry eventually right next to the exhaust manifold, I'm sure. So everything here is just loosely mounted up just to check clearances and all of that. Everything seems to fit fine. The top oil hose will go in there just fine. Got the exhaust V-band tightened in. The exhaust in the bottom, that just slides into a piece of flex tubing, and so that gives me lots of leeway in and out, and that fits just fine. The lower oil drain hose, you can see the flange for it right here. That fit just fine. Now you can just barely see here the lower oil drain line is pretty close to the wastegate spring. Right there, that rusty round piece, that's the oil drain line, and you can see the wastegate spring there. And that is a pretty close clearance, so just I got lucky, I guess. Keep that in mind when you're making your spring gate. Also, my bracket is also pretty close to the exhaust manifold, so keep that in mind. Again, you can see I got kind of lucky there. I got maybe a 1/4 inch of clearance. You could easily make this bracket narrower. I just wanted to make it kind of chunky for rigidity. Take this time now to note the orientation, whether the adjustment nut is pointing this way or that way. And in cases like this right here, this boot is pretty close to my inlet, so there might be a little bit of interference issues. So make sure when you're tightening your T-bolt clamps not to have the T-bolt like right here where it's going to hit into this tube. Maybe have it over here, and make sure that the bolt is pointing in a direction that makes it easy for you to tighten it and take it off later on if need be. My filtered air inlet fits just fine. This tube is laying on top of my compressor outlet tube, metal to metal, which isn't the biggest problem. It actually helps keep my filter off of the fender. Originally this was resting on the fender, and it kind of starts wearing through the filter a little bit. And this is an $80 filter, so I want to make it last as long as I can. But things that are touching each other and vibrating have been known to wear through, even if it's something that you think is pretty indestructible or tough. So what I'm going to do is put a little piece of rubber in between these two for protection. One more important thing, I should have mentioned this first. When you're bolting the turbo up to the manifold, I just tighten two nuts opposite each other, opposite corners, but don't tighten them. Just get it just like finger tight. You don't want to crush that gasket, because if you do have an issue and you need to take the turbo off, and you've already crushed the gasket, you've already ruined it, so you should buy a new gasket. Well, the moment has come. Everything's in, everything's tightened. I put a little square of rubber between those two tubes there. I just twisted them down with some baling wire. Not the prettiest solution, but it'll work just fine. So I don't have to worry about those two intake and compressor outlet tubes rubbing a hole through each other due to vibration. Everything's tightened, everything's double checked, and the last thing to do is to fire it up and see what happens. Now keep in mind it is cold and it's been sitting for a while. It's probably, I don't know, only about 35 degrees out today, maybe 40, but I think about 35, and we've had some freezing nights, so it's going to run a little rough right off the bat. I'm pretty sure of that. I'm just taking a look now, making sure there's no oil leaking, no exhaust leaking, nothing flopping around that shouldn't be flopping around. Keep an ear out for any exhaust leaks. Clears up pretty fast. Now I'll let the engine warm up a little bit and take it for a test drive. Well, that about sums it up, everybody. A friend of mine came over, so I'm not able to finish this video in the daylight, but luckily I don't really have anything else to show you. I just wanted to talk to you a little bit about it. Took it for a quick test run. Everything seems to work pretty good. One strange thing, this is like I might have mentioned before, this is a remanufactured turbo, so everything was pretty fresh and tight in there. And it seemed that the first a couple minutes, 5 or 10 minutes I ran it, the turbo wasn't as responsive, it wasn't as noisy, didn't make as much boost as it did maybe 15 or 20 minutes into driving. I don't know if that was just me, the way I was driving it, the hills I was on, or if it was something about how the bearings and everything need to kind of break in to allow the turbo to spin freely. I don't know. But I noticed that, and I think my exhaust might be hitting something a little bit, because there's a strange vibration on the passenger floorboard when I'm at idle with a cold engine, but that's not a big deal. As far as performance, it seems to work pretty good. I think my spring gate is adjusted a little bit too loose, but that's really hard to tell without a real load on the engine, or at least either a trailer or some weight in the bed. I'm just driving empty, just driving up and down some hills. A hill is a decent way to get an idea of how your motor acts under load, but these motors are so powerful, going up a hill in 4th or even 5th gear really doesn't put too much of a load on it, so you're really not going to push the turbo to the full potential. And of course, the more load you have on your engine, the more boost you're going to have. So that's about it. Of course, there's some pump tuning that I'm going to want to do along with this now that I have more air, more boost, more responsive boost available to me. I'm not going to talk about that in this video. That's definitely a separate video if I do decide to do that. But I'm going to mess with the AFC top, the pump top there, and mess with the star wheel, the fuel pin, etc., the fuel screw, because just putting on a turbo isn't going to give you more power. It might clear up some smoke you have, but it's really not going to give you any more power because you're not giving it any more fuel. You have to tell the pump to give it more fuel to get more power. So all in all, I like it so far. It's not super crazy different, but again, that's a fueling thing as well. It was very quiet. I think I might try taking that silencer ring out. I do like the sound of a turbo whistle, so I might try taking that silencer ring out in the compressor housing there to see if I can make it talk a little bit more. Because it was a lot quieter, more quiet of a turbo than I expected. But everything's tight, nothing leaks, nothing fell apart, nothing catastrophic happened. It started and runs and drives just as it should and just as it used to. So I hope this helps out you guys. Hopefully, if one of you guys out there, you're doing this swap yourself, I hope this makes it a little bit easier for you. You now know what to expect and know what to do and know what to prepare. And like I said before, nobody ever told me that turbo flange has to be machined down, and also that manifold stud that you're looking at, I had to cut about 3/16 of an inch off the end, which didn't matter because there were no threads on it anyway, in order for it to clear that exhaust housing. Otherwise it hit the housing. And that's about all I can think of to say about it right now. Make sure to leave a comment, hit the subscribe button if you haven't already, hit the like button, ask me a question, etc. You know the deal. So thanks for watching, everybody. Make sure to come back for more.